Hello, and welcome to another cross-examine video. In this video, I'm going to kick off kind of like a little mini-series where we examine some of Jesus' more unpopular teachings. Jesus obviously taught many things in his ministry on earth. We can read through the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to get an idea of what he taught. And when it comes to our churches nowadays, there are many teachings that we tend to focus on almost exclusively. We hear a lot of the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, the Blessed are the poor, Blessed are the meek, so on and so forth, or the Turn the other cheek, let my children come to me. You know, we're pretty familiar with all of those teachings, but I want to look at the passages that churches tend to avoid. There's a lot of passages that some pastors like to ignore altogether. We like to build kind of our own version of Jesus that is always loving and kind, never angry, and he's always peaceful and welcoming, and he's never divisive. And what I want to tell you here today is that Jesus doesn't exist. He's a Jesus that we've kind of constructed to fit nicely in our little box. The first passage that I'm going to cover for the series today should kind of shatter that box entirely for us. Now remember, these are Jesus' teachings, these are his words, so if we claim to be followers of Christ, then we should probably understand his teachings and what he kind of lays out for his followers. Now this first teaching is actually kind of twofold. We're going to cover two passages, but they fit together in terms of their theme. So the first comes from Luke 12, verses 51 through 53. Jesus says, "Do you think that I have come to give peace on earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. For from now on, in one house there will be 5 divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law." The second teaching is also found in Luke, this time in Luke 14, verse 26. Jesus says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." Now, does that sound like the peaceful and cuddly Jesus that we often get from our American Western churches? So I want to say this from the outset. These are difficult passages. These passages show that following Jesus comes at a cost. So I get why preachers avoid these texts. It's hard. It's hard to get buy-in from people when you're saying things like this. But Jesus thought it was important enough to clarify this to his disciples and to the crowds who would listen to him. So let's dig into these passages. If we're not careful, these passages could seem to be contradictory. For example, we know that through Jesus' sacrifice and resurrection that we as Christians have peace with God. So how can Jesus say that he did not come to bring peace, but instead came to divide? Well, let's look at the context. First, we'll look at Luke 12. In this chapter, Jesus goes back and forth from teaching his disciples to teaching to a larger crowd. You can kind of imagine him speaking to a large crowd, and his disciples are close to him, and he'll turn to his disciples and give them an inside scoop, and then he'll turn back to the crowd and teach, and then he'll go back to the disciples and back to the crowd, and then he kind of repeats that cycle. So in this passage, he has turned to his disciples at this point, and he's giving them insight into what he's teaching. He begins a pretty brutal parable of what will happen to those who reject Christ. Basically, in this parable, there are those who are not ready, and as Jesus puts it, will be cut into pieces. The punishment for living a life apart from Christ is harsh, because it ultimately means a life of rejecting God. And then we come to verse 49, where Jesus says that he came to cast fire on the earth and that he wished it was already happening. Now, there are a few meanings for fire in the Bible, but context generally makes it pretty clear about what we're referring to. And in this passage, I think it's pretty clear that Jesus is talking about the fire of judgment. He came to bring judgment on the earth, and he wishes that it was already kindled, or that judgment had already begun. Now we don't think about this like a pagan God that's just itching to throw people into hell. Thankfully, Jesus doesn't stop there. In verse 50, he says that he has a baptism coming that is greatly distressing him until it's accomplished. He's referring to his death, his execution. He knows what's coming, and it's all wrapped up in God's master plan of judgment and mercy and salvation. So Jesus' desire for judgment comes from his motivation as God to fulfill his plan, to perfectly execute the plan that God has. And the other part may come from his humility. He knows what's coming around the corner for him. He will be brutally tortured and put to death, and he's eager to get that over with, understandably. So it's this balance of God's judgment and the coming crucifixion, and that brings us to verse 51, where Jesus says that he didn't come to bring peace on earth, but division. Now, this may sound like it's directly in conflict with a famous passage that we've come to know and love around Christmas. Luke 2:14 is a famous verse that we commonly know as, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace, goodwill towards men. That's the King James Version. That's the version that people are very familiar with. So if we're pitting these verses against one another, they may seem to contradict. One says, yes, peace on earth, and the other says, nope, no peace, but instead division. So which one's right? Well, this is why it's important to understand the translations that we use. The King James is a fine translation, but it's also old. It's a very old translation, and we've had a lot of manuscripts discovered for translating between now and then. So a more proper translation for this verse would actually be, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those with whom he is pleased. And that lines up perfectly with the passage in Luke 12. It's not about peace between believers and unbelievers. It's about peace between us and God. And the disciples were missing this message. So Jesus clarifies and says, hey, I didn't come here so that you would have an easy and peaceful life with everyone. In fact, what I came for is actually the opposite. It's going to bring division between those that you are closest with. Jesus says that fathers will be against their sons, mothers against their daughters, in-laws against one another, and children against their parents. These are supposed to be the groups of people that we can count on to be at peace with. But Jesus isn't saying that by following him, we should be purposely at war with these people. It's not like we become Christians and we're like, oh, cool, I hate my dad now. But he does say that the message that he brings will bring division. And that actually brings us to the second passage in Luke 14, where Jesus says that we can't even be a disciple if we don't hate our families and even our own lives. Why would he say that? First, let's set the context. This is still Jesus speaking, but the setting is a little different. This time he's at a dinner party. Kind of. So it's a little more intimate than when he was speaking with a large crowd in Luke 12. At this dinner party, Jesus starts sharing parables that invite us to be humble and to care for the poor. And then we come to this strange parable in verse 16. Jesus tells the story of a man who hosted a great banquet. He invited many people. He sends his servant to those who were invited to let them know that the banquet's ready, but the servant keeps getting these excuses. Some people said, I just bought some land and I have to go tend to the land. I just bought some livestock. I have to go care for them. I just got married, so I have to go deal with that. People kept throwing out all these excuses about why they couldn't come to the banquet. So the man tells his servant to go instead and invite the poor and the crippled. So the servant does this, and there's still more room at the banquet. So the man tells the servant to go to the edge of the land and tell those people to come too. And then the parable ends with this pretty harsh statement. The man says that those who were originally invited will not taste the banquet. They missed their opportunity to come because they placed a higher priority on their land and their livestock and their marriage. So at this point, Luke points out that a great crowd has accompanied Jesus. Really, wherever Jesus went, a great crowd kind of followed along. So even when he's at this dinner with a Pharisee, a great crowd was near. They may have been outside the home where they were eating. Maybe they were within earshot, or maybe they were eating in a place where they could see the crowd. Regardless, Jesus now turns his attention to the crowd to hammer this point home. He tells them what we already read in verse 26. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. He goes on in verses 27 through 33 by saying, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish. All who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king goes out to encounter another king in war will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. That last verse, verse 33, is the key explanation for both of these passages. I'll read it again so that it sinks in for us. Therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. There is a cost to following Jesus. Following Jesus means that our families may disown us. In the face of that threat of disownment, Jesus is saying life with me is more important than life with your family. Your relationship with Jesus is more important than your marriage, your job, your hobbies, or whatever else comes up in life. That's what Jesus means when he says that you must hate your mother, father, wife, children, and so on. He's not saying that you have to actively hate them. He's saying that you need to put him first. And in putting him first, your families might think that you hate them. And that also explains what we read in Luke 12, where it says, Christ came not to bring peace, but to divide. Following Christ likely means that you will find division in your life. People will see that you are a passionate lover of God, and they will hate that. You might lose friendships. You might lose your job. You might lose family members. And Christ says that you need to count the cost of that and understand what is being asked of you when you say yes to life with him. That's what he's getting at in Luke 14 when he talks about the builder who begins building a house but realizes he doesn't have what he needs to finish it and ends up being mocked. That's what can happen to people who get so passionate about life with Christ, but they don't properly count the cost. They might find themselves stopping and backing out because they don't realize what's being asked of them. And these are important themes for us, important enough for Jesus to address it a few times in his short ministry. And he's not saying these things to scare people off. He's informing his disciples and the crowds so that they know what they're getting into. And so hopefully that's what this video does for you too. Hopefully you have a better grasp of what Jesus is asking you to consider in life with him. Trust me, life with Christ is great. It is worth it. Peace with God is worth everything we can give, everything we can renounce. And that means we have to be willing to give everything we have, because there will be division. Jesus promises that. But through all of that, he is present and we have peace with him. And that is a truly wonderful thing. But hey, maybe I missed something. Maybe I'm overemphasizing something. Maybe you disagree with something I said. Maybe you do agree with something I said and you want to make that known. I would love to continue the discussion with you. I think these are very important topics for us to be mindful of as we go through life with Christ. So if I missed something, if you want to discuss it, reach out and let me know. I'd love to hear from you. But as always, thanks for watching. As always, thanks for watching. May God bless you, and I'll see you soon.